The untouchable power. The city of Wellington was one where skyscrapers kissed the clouds, and the shadow of power loomed over every corner. At the heart of its wealth and corruption was Alexander Grant, a billionaire tycoon whose name carried weight in every boardroom, court, and social circle. For 3 decades, Grant had amassed his empire through a combination of charm, ruthlessness, and an unshakable belief that money could buy anything or anyone. Grant's influence was a carefully crafted weapon. Politicians owed their campaigns to him. The police department whispered his name in reverence and fear. Judges ruled in his favor without a second thought. He was the man who could topple fortunes with a single phone call and silence dissent with a wave of his hand. His signature graced countless documents that reshaped Wellington, often at the expense of its most vulnerable citizens. Among those who had suffered under his reign were the families who once thrived in the now-razed Lincoln Heights district. Once a vibrant, working-class neighborhood, Lincoln Heights was leveled to make way for Grant's flagship project, the Luminary, a luxury tower boasting penthouses for the world's elite. Those displaced received little more than hollow promises of future compensation, while Grant pocketed millions from government subsidies meant to provide affordable housing. Despite countless accusations, Grant always emerged unscathed. Evidence vanished, witnesses recanted, and investigations were quietly shelved. He was untouchable, a master of the art of evasion. But as the sun rose on a cool Monday morning, a new battle awaited him, one that would challenge his fortress of wealth and power. In Courtroom 214 of the Wellington Federal Courthouse, Judge Benjamin Hale reviewed the case files that had dominated headlines for weeks. Known for his unshakable demeanor and dedication to the law, Judge Hale was an anomaly in a system riddled with corruption. His rise to the bench was a testament to his resilience. A black man from a working-class background, he had clawed his way through systemic barriers to become one of the few beacons of integrity in Wellington's judiciary. Hale's chambers were modest, adorned with bookshelves brimming with legal texts and framed photographs of his family. The centerpiece was a portrait of his late father, a steelworker who had instilled in him a deep respect for honesty and hard work. As Hale sipped his morning coffee, his clerk, Evelyn Reed, entered with an air of urgency. "They've just announced," Evelyn said, placing a tablet on Hale's desk. Grant's defense team filed a motion to delay the trial. Hale sighed, his eyes scanning the headlines that flashed across the screen. Billionaire Alexander Grant faces federal fraud charges in high-stakes trial. "What's their excuse this time?" he asked, setting the tablet down. "Claiming incomplete discovery, but the prosecution insists they provided everything required." Hale nodded. "We've seen this tactic before. Delay, deflect, and derail. Notify the attorneys. The trial proceeds as scheduled." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Of course, Judge Hale." At precisely 9:00 a.m., the courtroom was packed. Rows of reporters filled the gallery, cameras flashing as they captured the man of the hour. Alexander Grant arrived with his signature flair, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys led by the formidable Claudia Starks, a legal juggernaut known for her aggressive tactics and near-perfect track record. Grant's tailored suit and polished demeanor exuded confidence, but beneath his smug exterior, his eyes betrayed flickers of unease. Judge Hale entered the courtroom, his presence commanding immediate respect. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the gallery stood in unison, except for Grant. As Hale took his seat, he noticed Grant lounging casually, scrolling through his phone. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, the audacity of the act stunning even seasoned observers. Hale's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Grant," he said evenly, "in this courtroom, respect is not optional. I suggest you stand before we proceed." Grant glanced up, his expression one of mock surprise. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his smile sharp and condescending. "Of course, Your Honor. My apologies for the oversight." The moment passed, but the tension lingered. The opening statements began, with Assistant District Attorney Rachel Vaughn laying out a damning case against Grant. She spoke of stolen pension funds, offshore accounts, and the deliberate targeting of low-income communities for personal profit. Her voice carried the weight of countless victims, each robbed of their futures by Grant's greed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vaughn concluded, addressing the jury, "this case isn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. It's about accountability. It's about proving that no one, not even a billionaire, is above the law." Claudia Starks followed, her tone icy and precise. "The prosecution's case is built on speculation and flimsy evidence. My client is a respected businessman who has contributed greatly to this city. This trial is nothing more than a baseless attack on his character." As the day's proceedings unfolded, Hale observed both attorneys carefully. Vaughn's passion was matched by Stark's calculated precision, and Grant remained a picture of nonchalance. But as witnesses testify about fraudulent deals and missing funds, cracks began to form in his armor. During a recess, Hale retreated to his chambers, where a folded note awaited him on his desk. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. It read, "Grant owns half the courthouse. Evidence will vanish. Witnesses will fold. Watch your back." Hale stared at the note, his mind racing. He had faced threats before, but this was different. The stakes were higher, the opposition more dangerous. He slipped the note into his desk drawer, determined to press forward. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial resumed. Vaughn called her first key witness, a former accountant from Grant's company named Ethan Cole. Nervous but resolute, Cole detailed the intricate web of shell companies and fake accounts used to siphon funds. "Mr. Cole," Vaughn asked, "why did you come forward?" Cole hesitated, his voice shaking. "Because I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. People lost everything. Retirement savings, homes, futures, all so Mr. Grant could add another zero to his bank account." Starks immediately pounced during cross-examination, questioning Cole's credibility and motives. "Isn't it true, Mr. Cole, that you were terminated from Grant Enterprises for misconduct? That your testimony could be seen as retaliation?" "No," Cole said firmly. "I was fired because I refused to participate in the fraud." As the day ended, Hale reflected on the unfolding trial. The battle ahead would be grueling, but he was determined to see it through. For every victim who had lost hope, for every community devastated by Grant's greed, Hale vowed to uphold the principles that had guided him his entire life. Justice would not come easily, but it would come. The cracks began to show. The morning air in Wellington was heavy with tension, as if the city itself knew a storm was brewing. In the sprawling glass tower of Grant Enterprises, Alexander Grant stood in his private office, gazing out at the skyline he had helped shape. His reflection in the window revealed the polished mask he wore for the world. Silver hair immaculately styled, a suit tailored so precisely it seemed to be an extension of his skin, and a smile that spoke of power unchecked. But that mask was beginning to slip. "Claudia," Grant snapped into the speakerphone on his desk, "what the hell happened yesterday? That accountant wasn't supposed to testify. I thought we had taken care of him." On the other end of the line, Claudia Starks, his lead attorney, maintained her composure. "Cole's testimony was unexpected, yes, but I already filed motions to discredit him. His firing for misconduct gives us a strong angle. The jury will see him as a disgruntled employee." Grant clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing at the city below. "Discrediting isn't enough. I want him neutralized." "Alex," Claudia's voice dropped to a whisper, "be careful what you say. There are limits to what even I can defend." Grant ended the call abruptly, his frustration mounting. For decades, his money had been a shield, his influence a sword. But now, cracks were forming in his carefully constructed empire, and he could feel them widening. Meanwhile, at the Wellington Federal Courthouse, Judge Benjamin Hale entered Courtroom 214 with his usual steady gait, his black robes trailing behind him like the weight of justice itself. The gallery was packed again, journalists elbowing for space and spectators buzzing with speculation about what the day might bring. Hale's face remained impassive, but inside, he was preparing for the challenges ahead. Evelyn, his clerk, approached him before proceedings began, her face tight with concern. "Judge Hale," she whispered, "you should know there's been another incident." Hale's eyes darkened. "What kind of incident?" "Ethan Cole. He called the courthouse this morning. Someone broke into his apartment last night. He's okay, but he says they took his laptop, his notes, everything." Hale exhaled slowly, the weight of the information settling on his shoulders. "Notify the U.S. Marshals. Cole needs protection. This isn't just a trial, it's a war." The trial resumes. The first witness of the day was a forensic accountant, Clara Mendoza, who had spent months untangling the labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts Grant used to hide his illicit activities. Clara was a petite woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, her confidence radiating as she took the stand. Rachel Vaughn, the assistant district attorney, approached with deliberate steps, her voice steady. "Ms. Mendoza, can you explain for the court what you discovered during your investigation into Grant Enterprises?" Clara nodded, her fingers clasping the edges of the witness stand. "What I found," she began, "was a systematic and deliberate effort to conceal millions of dollars. Funds were funneled through a series of shell corporations registered in tax havens, then moved into personal accounts controlled by Mr. Grant. This wasn't a one-time event. It was a pattern spanning more than a decade." Vaughn handed Clara a stack of documents. "Are these the financial records you analyzed?" "Yes." "And what do they show?" Clara pointed to a highlighted section in one of the documents. "Here, for example, we see $2.3 million intended for a community development fund in Lincoln Heights. Instead, it was redirected to a private account registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Aurora Holdings, which we later confirmed is owned by Mr. Grant." The gallery erupted in whispers. Vaughn turned to the jury. "Ms. Mendoza, in your professional opinion, could these transactions have occurred without Mr. Grant's direct knowledge or involvement?" "Absolutely not," Clara replied firmly. "The complexity of these schemes required approval from the highest levels of the organization, and that means Mr. Grant." The defense strikes back. When it was Claudia Stark's turn to cross-examine, she rose with the confidence of a seasoned predator. Her voice was measured, her tone razor-sharp. "Ms. Mendoza," she began, "you've testified about millions of dollars and intricate financial records. But tell me, do you have any evidence that Mr. Grant personally authorized these transactions?" Clara hesitated. "The evidence suggests." Claudia interrupted, her eyebrows arching. "Or proves. There's a significant difference, wouldn't you agree?" Clara's confidence faltered slightly. "While I cannot produce a document with his signature, the pattern off." "Thank you, Ms. Mendoza," Claudia said smoothly, cutting her off. No further questions. Claudia returned to her seat, shooting a triumphant glance at Grant. The jury's expressions were mixed. Some seemed swayed by the defense's argument, while others appeared skeptical. Outside the courtroom, during the lunch recess, Vaughn and Hale met in his chambers. Vaughn was visibly frustrated. "She's twisting the lack of direct evidence into a weapon," Vaughn said, pacing the room. "We need something definitive." Hale leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "What about Cole's testimony?" "It's good," Vaughn admitted, "but without the stolen laptop and his original notes, Starks will tear him apart." Hale tapped his fingers on the desk, his mind racing. "We'll proceed with what we have. Sometimes the truth emerges not in a single moment, but through the accumulation of smaller ones. An unexpected revelation." The afternoon session brought a surprise witness, Maria Torres, a former administrative assistant at Grant Enterprises. Maria had worked for Grant for over 15 years before being abruptly fired. Her sudden appearance on the stand sent a ripple through the courtroom. Maria's testimony was a bombshell. She described late-night meetings in Grant's office, where shredded documents were disposed of in industrial incinerators. She recounted overhearing phone calls in which Grant instructed his associates to handle problematic employees. "Miss Torres," Vaughn asked, her voice steady, "why did you come forward now?" Maria hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. "Because I've watched too many good people suffer. I can't keep living with the guilt." The defense immediately objected, questioning Maria's credibility and motives. Claudia Starks insinuated that Maria's termination was due to her own misconduct, a claim Maria vehemently denied. The threats intensify. That evening, as Hale prepared to leave the courthouse, a security officer approached him. "Judge Hale," the officer said, his voice low, "we found this on your car." Hale unfolded the note, his stomach tightening. It read, "Step aside, or we'll come for your family next." Hale's mind raced. He thought of his wife, Lisa, and their 2 teenage sons. He thought of the late nights spent teaching his children the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. This was the ultimate test of those lessons. He pocketed the note and walked to his car, his expression grim but resolute. He wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. A turn in the tide. As the city slept, a young officer named Mark Sullivan sat at his desk in the Wellington Police Department, staring at a file marked confidential. He had uncovered something damning. Evidence of payments from Grant's accounts to high-ranking officials in the department. For weeks, he had wrestled with whether to come forward, knowing it could cost him his career, or worse. But that night, as he thought of his own children and the city they would inherit, Sullivan made a decision. He would go to the courthouse in the morning and tell Judge Hale everything. Unbeknownst to Sullivan, his decision would mark the beginning of the end for Alexander Grant's reign of terror, the battle for the truth. The next morning, Judge Benjamin Hale entered his chambers earlier than usual. He hadn't slept much, the weight of the previous day's threats pressing heavily on his shoulders. His mind replayed the words on the note left on his car. "Step aside, or we'll come for your family next." For the first time in his career, he felt the icy grip of fear, not for himself, but for his wife and sons. As he sat at his desk, Evelyn Reed, his loyal clerk, entered with a worried expression. "Your Honor," she began, placing a folder on his desk. "This came in late last night. It's from Officer Mark Sullivan. He says it's urgent." Hale opened the folder to find detailed financial records and surveillance photos. Payments from Alexander Grant's shell companies to various high-ranking officials in the Wellington Police Department. The names leaped off the page. Chief Inspector Gregory Wells, Detective Lucas Hayes, and Captain Margaret Reed. The attached note from Sullivan was brief. "Judge Hale, this evidence ties Grant directly to the corruption in the department. I've risked everything to bring this to you. I'll testify if necessary, but you need to know. They'll come after me next. Be careful." Hale felt a flicker of hope. This was the crack he had been waiting for, a thread to unravel Grant's entire web of corruption. But Sullivan's warning hung in the air. Grant's people would stop at nothing to protect their empire. The courtroom heats up. By the time court was in session, the gallery was packed, the tension palpable. The previous day's testimony from Maria Torres had left the defense scrambling, but Claudia Starks was far from defeated. Today, she was armed with new motions, her strategy clear: discredit, delay, and deflect. "Your Honor," Starks began as soon as Judge Hale took the bench, "we move to suppress the testimony of Maria Torres. Her claims are unverifiable, and her dismissal from Grant Enterprises undermines her credibility. This trial is turning into a circus of unsubstantiated accusations." Rachel Vaughn, the assistant district attorney, was ready. "Your Honor, Maria Torres' testimony is corroborated by financial records and emails obtained through subpoenas." The defense is grasping at straws. Hale held up a hand to silence them. "Ms. Starks, your motion is denied. The court will hear the rest of the prosecution's case. Let's proceed." The whistleblower. Rachel Vaughn called her next witness, Officer Mark Sullivan. The young officer approached the stand with a mix of determination and trepidation, his uniform pressed, but his hands trembling slightly. Officer Sullivan, Vaughn began, how long have you served in the Wellington Police Department? 5 years, Sullivan replied, his voice steadying as he spoke. And during that time, did you observe any irregularities involving Alexander Grant? Sullivan nodded. Yes, ma'am. I witnessed payments being funneled to high-ranking officials in the department. These payments were disguised as consulting fees, bonuses, or campaign contributions, but they were bribes meant to ensure Grant's protection. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Vaughn pressed on. Can you provide specific examples? Sullivan took a deep breath. I saw Chief Inspector Gregory Wells receive a briefcase full of cash after suppressing evidence in a major fraud investigation against Grant Enterprises. I also intercepted emails between Grant and Detective Lucas Hayes discussing the disappearance of key documents in this trial. Why are you coming forward now, Officer Sullivan? Because this corruption has gone too far, Sullivan said, his voice firm. Grant's people think they own the justice system. But justice isn't for sale. Claudia Starks rose for cross-examination, her eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. Officer Sullivan, you claim to have witnessed corruption within your department. Why didn't you report it sooner? I did, Sullivan replied, meeting her gaze. I filed reports with Internal Affairs, but they were ignored. That's when I realized the corruption went higher than I thought. Starks smirked. So you're saying you're the only honest cop in Wellington? No, Sullivan said evenly, but I am one of the few willing to stand up to people like Alexander Grant. A desperate move. During a recess, Hale retreated to his chambers to review the evidence Sullivan had provided. The financial records were damning, but they were just pieces of a larger puzzle. He needed something irrefutable, something that even Grant's money couldn't erase. As Hale sifted through the files, Evelyn entered, her face pale. Your Honor, there's been another break-in. This time at Officer Sullivan's apartment. Hale's jaw tightened. Was anyone hurt? No, but the place was ransacked. His family is being moved to a secure location. Hale nodded grimly. The escalation was predictable, but no less alarming. Grant was cornered, and cornered men were dangerous. The turn of the tide. That afternoon, Rachel Vaughn called her next witness, Detective Lucas Hayes. But as Hayes approached the stand, something was off. His normally confident demeanor was replaced by unease, his eyes darting toward Grant in the gallery. Detective Hayes, Vaughn began, you've worked on multiple cases involving Alexander Grant. Can you tell the court about your findings? Hayes hesitated, glancing at Grant, who offered him a subtle nod. I didn't find any evidence of wrongdoing. The gallery murmured, but Vaughn wasn't deterred. Detective Hayes, are you aware of the payments made to your account from Grant Enterprises? Hayes froze. What payments? Vaughn held up a bank statement. These payments, $50,000 deposited into your account on multiple occasions. Would you like to explain them? Hayes stammered, his carefully rehearsed composure unraveling. Those were consulting fees, legitimate consulting fees. Consulting for what exactly? Hayes floundered, his face flushed. Vaughn pressed harder. Detective Hayes, were these payments bribes to suppress evidence in this trial? Hayes glanced at Grant again, but this time there was no reassurance in the billionaire's eyes, only cold calculation. Finally, Hayes broke. Yes, he whispered. They were bribes. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters scribbled furiously, and Grant's attorneys scrambled to contain the fallout. Judge Hale pounded his gavel. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. Grant's mask slits. As the gallery settled, Vaughn turned her attention to Grant. Your Honor, the prosecution requests that Alexander Grant be called to the stand. Claudia Starks leaped to her feet. Your Honor, my client invokes his Fifth Amendment right. Denied, Hale said firmly. Mr. Grant will testify. Grant's confident facade finally cracked as he approached the stand. For years, he had manipulated the system with ease, but now, the weight of his crimes was bearing down on him. Mr. Grant, Vaughn began, "Did you authorize payments to police officials to obstruct this investigation?" Grant smirked, his arrogance returning in defiance. "Absolutely not." Vaughn produced a series of emails. "Then how do you explain these?" "Emails sent directly from your account, detailing payments and instructions to suppress evidence." Grant leaned back, his smile fading. "I don't recall sending those." Vaughn pressed on, her voice rising. "Mr. Grant, is it true that you have used your wealth and influence to destroy lives, silence dissent, and obstruct justice?" Grant's temper flared. "You think you can paint me as the villain here? I built this city. Everything you see, every skyscraper, every business, it exists because of me. People like you wouldn't have jobs if it weren't for men like me." His outburst stunned the courtroom. Vaughn, seizing the moment, turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard it from Mr. Grant himself. He believes he's untouchable, above the law. But in this courtroom, the law applies to everyone." As the day ended, Judge Hale reflected on the shift in momentum. The trial was far from over, but for the first time, it felt as though justice might prevail. Outside, protesters gathered in the growing twilight, their chants echoing through the courthouse walls. No one is above the law. In his chambers, Hale stared at the evidence on his desk, his resolve solidified. The road ahead would be dangerous, but he was ready. For the victims of Alexander Grant, for the people of Wellington, and for the very soul of justice, Hale knew he had to see this through. The fortress crumbles. The weight of the trial seemed to hang over Wellington like a storm cloud. In the city's bustling streets, citizens whispered about Alexander Grant's outburst on the stand. For years, his wealth and influence had shielded him, but now the cracks were undeniable. Grant Enterprises' stock was plummeting, media outlets were dissecting his testimony, and public opinion was turning against him. In the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric as people filed in for what promised to be another explosive day. Judge Benjamin Hale prepared in his chambers, sipping his coffee while reviewing the mounting evidence. The folder from Officer Mark Sullivan sat open on his desk, a reminder of the dangerous forces aligning against him. His wife's voice from the previous night echoed in his mind. "Ben, when does this stop?" Lisa had asked, her tone a mix of worry and frustration. "We can't keep looking over our shoulders." Hale had taken her hand, his gaze steady. "It stops when justice wins." The morning session. Rachel Vaughn was ready to strike again. She had spent the night combing through financial records and witness statements, building the case so airtight even Claudia Starks couldn't poke holes in it. The day began with Vaughn calling her next witness, David Martinez, the janitor who had narrowly escaped an abduction attempt. Martinez, a quiet man with weathered hands and a nervous demeanor, took the stand. His presence alone was a testament to courage. He had been threatened, followed, and nearly silenced, yet he was here. "Mr. Martinez," Vaughn began, "how long did you work at Grant Enterprises?" 10 years, Martins replied, his voice trembling but resolute. "And during that time, did you ever witness anything unusual?" "Yes." Martins cleared his throat. "I worked the night shift. Sometimes I'd see documents being shredded or carried out in locked briefcases. Once, I found a ledger left behind in a conference room. It detailed payments to people, names I didn't recognize at the time but later saw on the news. Police chiefs, judges. Why didn't you report this sooner?" Vaughn asked gently. Martinez hesitated, looking at the jury. "Because I was afraid. I have 2 daughters. Grant's people, they made it clear what would happen if I spoke up." "And why are you testifying now?" Martinez took a deep breath. "Because someone has to. If we all stay quiet, nothing changes." Claudia Starks cross-examines. Claudia Starks approached the stand with her signature poise, a predator circling her prey. "Mr. Martinez," she began, her tone dripping with condescension, "you say you found a ledger. Do you have this ledger with you?" "No," Martins admitted. "It was stolen from my apartment." "How convenient," Starks said with a smirk. "So we're supposed to take your word for it. A janitor who claims to have stumbled upon documents worth millions." Martinez's hands clenched the edge of the witness stand. "I may be a janitor," he said, his voice rising, "but I know what I saw. And I know the truth about Alexander Grant." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Starks, sensing she was losing ground, quickly ended her cross-examination. The hidden ally. As the court recessed for lunch, Judge Hale returned to his chambers to find a man waiting for him. A shadowy figure in a trench coat, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. Evelyn, Hale's clerk, stood nearby, looking uneasy. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice low, "my name is Samuel Blake. I used to work as a private investigator for Alexander Grant." Hale gestured for him to continue. "What do you want, Mr. Blake?" "I want to come clean," Blake said, pulling out a flash drive. "This contains recordings, emails, and surveillance footage I gathered over the years. Evidence of bribes, intimidation, even a hit list of people Grant wanted silenced." Hale's expression hardened. "Why now? Why not come forward before?" Blake hesitated. "Because I was on that payroll. But after what I've seen, the way he destroyed people's lives, it's too much. I can't be part of it anymore." Hale studied the man for a long moment before nodding. "This evidence will be secured. If it holds up, it could turn the tide." The afternoon session. When court resumed, Rachel Vaughn called Blake as a surprise witness. The courtroom erupted in whispers as the former investigator took the stand. Claudia Starks immediately objected, arguing that Blake's testimony was inadmissible due to his prior involvement with Grant. Judge Hale overruled her. Blake's testimony was devastating. "Mr. Blake," Vaughn began, "what was your role in Alexander Grant's organization?" "I was hired to clean up problems," Blake admitted. "That meant gathering dirt on opponents, intimidating witnesses, and destroying evidence." "And did you comply with these orders?" "At first, yes," Blake said, his voice heavy with regret. "But then I started documenting everything. I knew one day the truth would come out." "Can you provide examples?" Blake nodded. "There was a journalist, Leah Patterson, investigating Grant's offshore accounts. Grant ordered me to plant drugs in her apartment. She was arrested and discredited. Another time, I followed a whistleblower, Ethan Cole, and broke into his apartment to steal his files." "Did Mr. Grant directly authorize these actions?" "Yes," Blake said, his tone firm. "I reported to him personally." The defense in freefall. Claudia Starks looked visibly shaken. Her cross-examination was half-hearted, her attempts to discredit Blake falling flat. The jury seemed captivated by the damning evidence Vaughn presented alongside Blake's testimony. Recordings of phone calls where Grant gave explicit orders to silence dissenters. Grant sat at the defense table, his usual arrogance replaced by barely concealed rage. He whispered furiously to Starks, who tried to maintain her composure, but the cracks in their defense were now glaring. A dangerous escalation. That evening, as Judge Hale prepared to leave the courthouse, a black SUV idled near the entrance. Hale noticed it immediately. Its tinted windows and slow movements were too conspicuous. As he approached his car, a figure stepped out of the shadows. "Judge Hale," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "You've made some powerful enemies. Walk away from this case, or your family won't be safe." Hale didn't flinch. He met the man's gaze with unwavering resolve. "Tell Grant this. Justice doesn't bend for bullies." The man smirked and stepped back into the SUV, which sped off into the night. The evidence bombshell. The next morning, Hale authorized the FBI to investigate the contents of Samuel Blake's flash drive. What they found was explosive. An encrypted file containing a ledger of payments, surveillance footage of corrupt officials, and a recording of Grant discussing the murder of a rival. The prosecution wasted no time introducing this evidence in court. Vaughn played the recording for the jury, Grant's voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "Take care of him. Make it look like an accident. The impact was immediate. Jurors exchanged horrified glances. Reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously. Claudia Starks sat frozen, her face ashen. The tides turned. By the end of the day, it was clear that Grant's fortress of power was crumbling. Witnesses emboldened by the mounting evidence came forward, revealing even more damning details. Public opinion shifted fully against him, with protests outside the courthouse growing larger and louder. For Judge Hale, the fight was far from over. But for the first time, he felt that justice, real, uncorrupted justice, was within reach. The empire collapses. The tension in Wellington was palpable as the trial of Alexander Grant entered its fifth week. Outside the courthouse, a sea of protesters gathered daily, their chants echoing across the city streets. Signs demanding accountability and justice swayed in the winter wind, while news crews broadcast the growing fervor to a nation captivated by the trial. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was equally charged. The revelations from Samuel Blake's flash drive had sent shockwaves through the city. The evidence was damning. Concrete proof that Grant's corruption extended into every corner of Wellington's power structure. Even the most hardened skeptics now questioned whether the billionaire could escape justice this time. Judge Benjamin Hale sat in his chambers early that morning, staring at a black-and-white photo of his family on his desk. The previous night's threats replayed in his mind. The black SUV, the veiled warning. It was a reminder that Grant's reach was still formidable. But Hale's resolve was unshaken. He had come too far to back down now. "Your Honor," Evelyn Reed, his ever-reliable clerk, interrupted his thoughts. She placed a file on his desk, her expression grim. "The FBI delivered these this morning. They've identified more officials tied to Grant's network." Hale flipped open the file, his eyes scanning the list of names. City council members, high-ranking police officers, even a state senator. The corruption wasn't just pervasive, it was systemic. "Notify the prosecution," Hale said, closing the file. "They'll need this in court today." The trial resumes. When court reconvened, the gallery was packed to capacity. Alexander Grant entered flanked by his legal team, his trademark arrogance replaced by a simmering anger. For decades, he had been untouchable. But now, the tide was unmistakably turning against him. Rachel Vaughn began the day by calling Detective James Whitman to the stand. Whitman, who had been central to many of the prosecution's earlier allegations, had been apprehended the night before after the FBI intercepted his attempt to flee the city. Shackled and wearing an ill-fitting suit, Whitman's demeanor was sullen as he took his seat. "Detective Whitman," Vaughn began, her voice cool and sharp, "you've served in the Wellington Police Department for nearly 2 decades, correct?" "Yes," Whitman muttered, avoiding eye contact. "And during that time, you worked on several cases involving Mr. Grant. Is that correct?" "Yes." Vaughn stepped closer to the witness stand. "Did you ever receive payments from Alexander Grant or his affiliates in exchange for obstructing investigations or tampering with evidence?" Whitman hesitated, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. I didn't have a choice." "That's not an answer, Detective," Vaughn pressed. "Did you receive payments?" Whitman exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping. "Yes, I did." The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs. Vaughn allowed the noise to settle before continuing. "How much money did you receive?" "Over the years," Whitman's voice was barely a whisper. "About $1.2 million. "And what were these payments for?" Whitman looked down at his hands. "Destroying evidence, intimidating witnesses, making sure investigations went nowhere." Vaughn's voice cut through the stunned silence. "And who ordered you to do these things?" Whitman finally looked up, his face pale. "Alexander Grant." The turning point. Claudia Starks immediately rose to cross-examine, her tone as sharp as ever. "Detective Whitman, you've admitted to receiving bribes and engaging in corruption. How can this court trust anything you say?" Whitman's expression hardened. "Because I have nothing left to lose." Grant used me, just like he uses everyone. But I won't go down protecting him. The defense's strategy was unraveling, and the cracks in their case were growing more visible by the hour. Grant's desperation. During the afternoon recess, Alexander Grant sat in a private conference room with Claudia Starks and his legal team. His usual composure had completely shattered. "This is a circus," Grant hissed, pacing the room. "We need to shut this down." Starks leaned back in her chair, exhausted. "We're running out of options, Alex. The prosecution has a mountain of evidence, and now Whitman is flipping. Unless we can discredit him further, the jury." "Then find something," Grant snapped. "Anything." Starks hesitated before speaking. "There's one more option. If you plead guilty to lesser charges, we might be able to negotiate a reduced sentence." Grant's eyes blazed with fury. "Plead guilty? Never. I built this city. I'm not going to let a bunch of nobodies take me down." The final blow. The prosecution's next witness was the most anticipated yet. Claire Grant, Alexander's estranged sister. Claire had been the source of much of the evidence against her brother, and her decision to testify publicly was seen as a final act of defiance against the man who had once been her closest ally. Claire entered the courtroom with quiet dignity, her chin held high despite the glares from her brother. She took the stand, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Ms. Grant," Vaughn began, "you've testified that you worked alongside your brother for years at Grant Enterprises. Why did you decide to come forward?" Claire's voice was steady, though her eyes betrayed a hint of sadness. "Because I couldn't watch him destroy any more lives. I stayed silent for too long, thinking I could change things from within. But Alex, he's not just corrupt. He's dangerous. Can you elaborate?" Claire nodded. "He didn't just bribe officials or launder money. He hurt people who stood in his way. He ordered their lives ruined, their families threatened. And when that didn't work, he made them disappear." The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on Claire as she recounted specific instances of Grant's ruthlessness. She spoke of whistleblowers whose careers had been destroyed, journalists who had been silenced, and even a former business partner who had mysteriously died in a car accident. "Do you have evidence to support these claims?" Vaughn asked. Claire reached into her briefcase and produced a folder. "Emails, financial records, and phone call transcripts. It's all here." Grant's outburst. As the evidence was entered into the record, Grant finally snapped. He stood abruptly, his voice booming. "This is a joke. Claire, you're nothing but a bitter little traitor. You wouldn't have anything if it weren't for me." "Sit down, Mr. Grant," Judge Hale ordered, his voice firm. But Grant ignored him, pointing at Claire. "You think this will make you a hero? You're pathetic." "Mr. Grant," Hale repeated, his tone like thunder, "sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." Grant reluctantly sank back into his chair, his face flushed with rage. The jury watched the exchange intently, their expressions a mix of shock and disgust. The collapse. By the end of the day, it was clear that Grant's empire was in freefall. Vaughn's meticulous presentation of evidence, combined with the damning testimonies of Whitman, Claire, and others, had painted an irrefutable picture of corruption and cruelty. As Judge Hale adjourned for the day, the protesters outside cheered. For the first time in decades, it seemed that justice might actually prevail. In his chambers that evening, Hale reviewed the day's events. The case was nearing its climax, and the weight of the responsibility he carried was heavier than ever. But as he looked at the photo of his family on his desk, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but victory was within reach. The fall of the Titan. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting shadows over the faces of those present. The air was thick with anticipation. The trial of Alexander Grant had become more than just a courtroom battle. It was a fight for the soul of a city long buried under the weight of corruption. Claire's final words. Claire Grant remained composed on the stand, even as her brother's outburst reverberated in her memory. Her gaze flickered toward him briefly, her expression a mixture of pity and determination. Rachel Vaughn stepped forward, her tone calm but resolute. "Ms. Grant, if there's one message you want the jury to take away from your testimony, what would it be?" Claire drew a deep breath, her voice steady. "That no one, not even Alexander Grant, is above the law. For too long, my brother has believed his money and power could shield him from consequences. But power built on lies and fear is fragile. Eventually, the truth will break through." Her words hung in the air like a weight, resonating with everyone in the room. Even the jury, who had maintained neutral expressions throughout much of the trial, now appeared visibly moved. A desperate defense. During cross-examination, Claudia Starks was visibly strained. The steady stream of damning evidence and testimonies had left her defense strategy in tatters, and Claire's testimony was the most damaging yet. But Starks was relentless. "Ms. Grant," Starks began, her voice sharp, "you've painted a very negative picture of your brother. But isn't it true that your relationship with him soured years ago when he refused to promote you within Grant Enterprises?" Claire's eyes flashed with anger, but she maintained her composure. "Yes, we disagreed. But my decision to testify has nothing to do with personal grievances. It's about exposing the truth." Starks smirked. "And yet isn't it convenient that this truth only surfaced after you were cut out of the company's leadership?" Claire's voice rose slightly, her resolve unwavering. "Convenient? Do you think it was convenient to live in fear? To watch innocent people be ruined because they dared to stand up to my brother? My silence made me complicit, but not anymore." The tension between the two women was electric. Starks hesitated, realizing she had no further ground to stand on. "No further questions," she said, retreating to her seat. A secret deal. During the recess, Alexander Grant paced the holding room, his patience wearing thin. Claudia Starks entered, carrying a thick file and a grim expression. "Alex, we need to talk," she said, shutting the door behind her. "The evidence is overwhelming. You need to consider a plea deal." Grant scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't plead. Especially not to those vultures out there." "Listen to me," Starks snapped, her professionalism slipping. "If you don't, you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. They have the recordings, the witnesses, the financial records. We're out of moves." Grant's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For the first time, he looked unsure. The walls that had protected him for decades were crumbling, and there was nowhere left to hide. "What kind of deal?" he asked finally, his voice low. Starks hesitated. "If you cooperate, turn over the remaining officials involved in your schemes, you might get a reduced sentence. It's your only shot." Grant's laugh was hollow. "Throwing others under the bus. That's what you think I should do." "It's what you've always done," Starks replied bluntly. "You're just out of people to protect you." Grant glared at her, but didn't respond. The jury's perspective. In the jury's deliberation room, the weight of the case bore heavily on the 12 individuals tasked with deciding Grant's fate. The testimonies of Claire Grant, Detective Whitman, and Samuel Blake had left an indelible impression, but not all jurors were convinced. "I don't trust Claire," one juror said, leaning back in their chair. "She's his sister. She could be trying to settle a family score." "But the recordings," another countered. "You can't fake that." His own voice ordering those hits. "That's damning." "And what about Whitman?" Someone else chimed in. "Sure, he's corrupt, but he flipped on Grant. Why would he risk everything if it wasn't true?" The room fell silent as they contemplated the mountain of evidence. The jurors knew the stakes of their decision extended far beyond Alexander Grant. Their verdict would either affirm the rule of law or reinforce the belief that power and money could buy impunity. The media frenzy. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was at its peak. Reporters jostled for position, cameras flashing as pundits debated the day's developments. "This trial is the reckoning Wellington has needed for years," one commentator said. "If Grant is convicted, it will send a powerful message to those who believe they are untouchable." But let's not forget, another argued, Grant's defense team is one of the best in the country. A single misstep by the prosecution, and he could walk free. The public's hunger for justice had reached a fever pitch. Protesters carried signs reading, "No one is above the law, and justice for Wellington." Their chants filled the air, a constant reminder of the city's demand for accountability. The final testimony. As the court reconvened, Rachel Vaughn called her final witness, an FBI forensic analyst named Dr. Miriam Carter. Dr. Carter was tasked with authenticating the recordings and documents submitted as evidence. "Dr. Carter," Vaughn began, "can you confirm the authenticity of the recordings presented to the court?" "Yes," Dr. Carter replied. "We conducted extensive tests on the audio files, including voice matching technology. The recordings are genuine, and the voice is unequivocally Alexander Grant's. And the financial records, also authentic. The transfers, the offshore accounts, and the shell corporations all lead directly back to Grant Enterprises." Vaughn turned to the jury, her voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the evidence, seen the documents, and listened to the testimonies. The pattern is clear. Alexander Grant didn't just exploit the system. He built his empire by corrupting it." Grant's final play. When it was his turn, Alexander Grant took the stand in his defense. It was a risky move, but one he insisted on. He straightened his tie, his face a mask of calm confidence as he addressed the jury. "I built this city," Grant began, his voice measured. "The skyscrapers you see, the jobs you work, the economy that thrives, it's all because of me. Yes, I made deals. Yes, I bent the rules. But isn't that what leaders do? Isn't that how progress is made?" His words were calculated, designed to appeal to those who admired power and ambition. But as he spoke, the jurors' expressions shifted from intrigue to skepticism. "And the recordings," Vaughn interjected during cross-examination. "How do you explain those?" Grant hesitated for the first time. "Taken out of context," he said finally. "Twisted to fit a narrative. This is a witch hunt, nothing more." Vaughn's voice sharpened. "Mr. Grant, do you deny ordering bribes, threatening witnesses, or orchestrating violence?" "I deny nothing," Grant snapped, his composure cracking. "But you're all too blind to see the bigger picture. Without me, this city falls. The day ends." As court adjourned for the day, the gallery erupted in noise, whispers, gasps, and the hum of anticipation. The verdict was now within reach, and the weight of justice bore down on everyone involved. In his chambers, Judge Hale sat alone, the enormity of the case pressing heavily on him. He knew the fight wasn't just about Alexander Grant. It was about restoring faith in a system long believed to be irreparably broken. Tomorrow would bring the jury's deliberation. Tomorrow, the empire would finally rise or fall. The verdict. The morning of the final day of the trial dawned cold and gray, matching the solemn mood inside Wellington Federal Courthouse. The weight of the case hung heavy in the air as the courtroom filled with reporters, protesters, and spectators eager to witness the climax of what had become the trial of the decade. Outside, the chants of protesters grew louder, demanding accountability for Alexander Grant and the corrupt empire he had built. Judge Benjamin Hale entered the courtroom promptly at 9:00 a.m., his black robes flowing behind him. His expression was calm but resolute. He had spent the night reviewing his notes, the evidence, and the extraordinary twists and turns the trial had taken. Today, justice would finally speak. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the gallery stood as Hale took his seat. "Be seated," Hale said, his voice steady. "Today, the jury will deliver its verdict. Let me remind everyone that this is a court of law, and I will not tolerate any disruptions." All eyes turned to the jury box, where 12 men and women sat with expressions ranging from determined to nervous. For weeks, they had been presented with a mountain of evidence, damning testimonies, and emotional pleas. Now their decision would shape the legacy of not just Alexander Grant, but also the city of Wellington. The jury's return. At 9:12 a.m., the jury filed into the courtroom. The foreperson, a middle-aged teacher named Sarah Bennett, clutched the folded piece of paper containing their verdict. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she took her seat. Judge Hale addressed the jury. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," Bennett replied, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Please hand the verdict to the bailiff." The bailiff retrieved the paper and handed it to Hale. The judge unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the words. He nodded slightly, then returned the paper to the foreperson. "Madam Foreperson," Hale said, "please read the verdict aloud." "The verdict is read." Bennett's voice was clear but emotional as she read the jury's decision. "In the matter of the People versus Alexander Grant, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as the gallery processed the words that many had thought they'd never hear. Alexander Grant, the untouchable billionaire, was guilty. Reporters rushed to capture the scene, their cameras flashing in rapid succession. Outside, the crowd of protesters burst into cheers, their chants rising in triumph. Grant sat frozen, his face pale and expressionless. The man who had once commanded fear and respect now looked like a shadow of himself. His lead attorney, Claudia Starks, placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering something in his ear, but he didn't respond. Judge Hale banged his gavel. "Order. I will have order in this courtroom." The gallery quieted, though the tension remained electric. "Grant speaks." As the murmurs subsided, Grant stood abruptly, his face contorted with rage. He turned to address the court, ignoring his attorney's attempts to stop him. "This is a farce," he shouted, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. "You think this changes anything? You think convicting me makes you heroes? This city runs on power, and I am power. Lock me up, and someone else will take my place. You're all just pawns in a system you'll never control." Judge Hale's voice cut through Grant's tirade like a knife. "Mr. Grant, that is enough. One more outburst, and you will be removed from this courtroom." Grant glared at Hale, his jaw clenched, but he sat down, muttering under his breath. The sentencing. After a brief recess, the court reconvened for sentencing. Judge Hale's tone was measured but firm as he addressed Grant. "Mr. Grant, you have been convicted on multiple counts, including fraud, bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The evidence presented in this trial has revealed not just a pattern of criminal behavior, but a blatant disregard for the rule of law and the lives of the people you exploited." Hale paused, his gaze steady. "Your actions have caused immeasurable harm to this city and its citizens. The justice system exists to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and it will not be bought, intimidated, or corrupted." The courtroom was silent as Hale delivered the sentence. "I hereby sentence you to 40 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Furthermore, all assets tied to your criminal activities will be seized and redistributed to compensate the victims of your schemes." The gallery erupted again, this time in applause. Tears streamed down the faces of some spectators, while others hugged one another in relief and triumph. Outside, the cheers of the protesters grew louder, their victory echoing through the city streets. The aftermath. As Alexander Grant was led away in handcuffs, reporters followed closely, shouting questions he refused to answer. His once commanding figure seemed smaller now, dwarfed by the weight of his defeat. Claire Grant watched from the gallery, her expression a mixture of relief and sadness. She had helped bring her brother to justice, but the cost had been high. As she left the courthouse, a group of protesters approached her, offering thanks and words of encouragement. Rachel Vaughn stood outside the courthouse steps, addressing a sea of reporters. This case wasn't just about Alexander Grant. It was about proving that no one, not even the most powerful among us, is above the law. Today, justice has prevailed. Judge Hale reflects. Later that evening, Judge Hale sat alone in his chambers, the courtroom now silent. The trial was over, but the battle for Wellington's soul was far from finished. The systemic corruption exposed during the trial would take years to fully dismantle, but for the first time in decades, the city had hope. Hale looked at the photo of his family on his desk, a faint smile touching his lips. He had faced threats, intimidation, and immense pressure, but he had stayed true to his principles. Justice had won, not just for the victims of Alexander Grant, but for everyone who believed in the power of truth. The city awakens. The next morning, Wellington awoke to a new chapter. Headlines declared, "Billionaire Alexander Grant found guilty. Justice restored in landmark case." Citizens felt a renewed sense of empowerment, knowing that even the mightiest could be held accountable. And in a quiet federal prison, Alexander Grant sat in his stark cell, staring at the cold concrete walls. His empire was gone, his reputation shattered, and his name forever tarnished. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. Justice had prevailed. The reckoning and the rebirth. A city transformed. The streets of Wellington hummed with a new kind of energy in the weeks following the trial. The conviction of Alexander Grant wasn't just a legal victory, it was a symbolic one. For a city long gripped by corruption and despair, the verdict represented hope. Headlines continued to dissect the trial. From the damning testimonies to Grant's dramatic outburst in court, news anchors declared it the trial of the century, and editorials praised the courage of the witnesses, the prosecutors, and Judge Benjamin Hale. But beneath the surface, the work of rebuilding had just begun. The cleanup. Rachel Vaughn stood at a podium in front of a crowded press conference, flanked by federal agents and city officials. The new task force she spearheaded had been launched with a clear mandate: root out corruption wherever it hid. The investigation had already led to the arrests of several high-ranking officials implicated by evidence uncovered during the trial. Alexander Grant may have been the most visible figure in this web of corruption, Vaughn announced to the crowd, but he was not the only one. The work to restore trust in our institutions begins now, and it will require the dedication of every honest official and every citizen of Wellington. The crowd erupted in applause, but Vaughn's expression remained serious. She knew that the fight ahead would be just as challenging as the trial itself. The Grant family. Claire Grant sat alone in her modest apartment, staring at the photo of her family taken years ago. Her brother Alexander smiled in the picture, a younger, more hopeful version of the man he had become. The trial had taken a toll on her, but she felt a sense of peace for the first time in years. Her phone buzzed with a call. It was from her father's former lawyer. "Claire," the man said, "I wanted to let you know that the restitution fund is moving forward. The victims of Alexander's schemes will finally get the support they deserve. Your testimony was instrumental in making this happen." "Thank you," Claire replied, her voice soft. After the call ended, she sat back, tears welling in her eyes. She had lost her brother to greed and ambition, but she had gained a purpose. She vowed to use her inheritance and influence to rebuild the communities her brother had destroyed. Grant in prison. In a stark federal prison far from the luxury of his penthouse, Alexander Grant sat on the edge of his metal cot, staring at the gray walls. The hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of clanging metal doors were constant reminders of his new reality. His cellmate, an older man with a gruff demeanor, eyed him with curiosity. "You're that billionaire, right? Thought you were untouchable." Grant didn't respond. He had nothing left to say. His lawyers had tried to appeal the verdict, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. His empire was gone, his reputation destroyed, and his wealth seized. At night, he lay awake, haunted by the faces of those he had hurt, the whistleblowers, the employees, the communities he had devastated. For the first time in his life, there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. Judge Hale's legacy. Judge Benjamin Hale stood on the steps of the courthouse, gazing out at the city he had fought so hard to protect. The trial had tested him in ways he never imagined. Threats against his family, attempts to smear his reputation, and the sheer weight of the case had pushed him to his limits. But he had prevailed, guided by the principles his father had instilled in him. Lisa Hale approached, slipping her hand into his. "You did it, Ben," she said softly. "You stood your ground." He smiled, the lines on his face softening. "We all did. This wasn't just about me. It was about proving that the system can work if good people are willing to fight for it." As they walked down the steps together, reporters shouted questions, but Hale ignored them. His focus was on the future, his family, his city, and the renewed hope that justice could prevail. A new chapter. Months later, the city of Wellington began to show signs of transformation. The restitution fund established with grants seized assets brought relief to communities devastated by his schemes. New housing developments were planned for Lincoln Heights, scholarships were created for students in underserved neighborhoods, and the local police department underwent a massive overhaul, with several corrupt officers replaced by new recruits who pledged to serve with integrity. Rachel Vaughn continued her work as a prosecutor, her name now synonymous with justice. She received offers from prestigious law firms and even inquiries about running for office, but she remained focused on her mission. "There's still work to be done," she told a reporter. "Justice isn't a destination. It's a journey." Claire Grant founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to rebuilding Wellington's most neglected neighborhoods. She spoke at community meetings, emphasizing accountability and the importance of standing up to power. "My brother's mistakes don't define me," she told one crowd. "What defines us is how we move forward." The final scene. On a crisp autumn morning, Judge Hale visited Lincoln Heights, the neighborhood Alexander Grant had once destroyed. The sound of construction filled the air as workers began building a new community center funded by the restitution fund. As Hale walked through the site, a young boy approached him, clutching a soccer ball. "Are you the judge who put that bad guy in jail?" the boy asked. Hale smiled. "I'm one of the people who helped. But it wasn't just me. A lot of people stood up for what was right." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with admiration. "My mom says you're a hero." Hale crouched down to the boy's level, his smile widening. "The real heroes," he said, gesturing to the workers and community members around them, "are the people who keep fighting to make things better." As the boy ran off, Hale stood and took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs. Wellington wasn't perfect, but it was on the path to redemption. And for Hale, that was enough. For now.